Imagine this. A routine welfare check turns into a nightmare you can't wake up from. What happens when you cross paths with something unexplainable? Stick around, because what unfolds next will leave you questioning reality. You won't believe how this story ends. Stay tuned, because this isn't just another horror tale. It's a chilling journey into the unknown. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a dim light through the curtains. Inside the small house, silence lingered. The clock on the wall ticked. A faint creak of wood underfoot. Officer Mays stepped inside, her boots soft against the floorboards. She had been sent for a routine welfare check. Just another day. The house smelled musty, like forgotten memories. A stale air that clung to the corners of every room. "Hello," Mays called. Her voice echoed, swallowed by the emptiness. No response. She glanced around, noting the dim, yellowed walls. A small kitchen, dishes stacked by the sink. Nothing unusual. The house felt off, though, like a pressure in the air. A weight, invisible but heavy. She stepped deeper inside. A door to the left creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway. It was darker here, the shadows stretching longer than they should. May's fingers brushed the walls as she moved forward, the chill of the plaster biting against her skin. There was a faint smell of something. Something sharp, but she couldn't place it. "Mr. Daniels," she called again, stepping cautiously. Still no response. Her eyes scanned the hallway. At the end, a door stood ajar, almost as if inviting her. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. The air grew colder. She pushed the door open. The room was small, dimly lit. A single light bulb swayed above, casting eerie shadows. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and twisted. And there, the figure of a man, slumped against the wall. His head tilted awkwardly to the side, eyes wide and unblinking. Mays froze. Her stomach twisted. Something about his stillness felt wrong. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than the clock on the wall. She stepped closer, her feet silent against the floor. The room smelled. She inhaled sharply. The scent. It hit her then. Iron. Metallic. Sharp. The man's neck was bent at a strange angle. A dark, crimson stain spread from his throat, pooling beneath him. And it was then she saw it. The message, smeared in red on the wall behind him. Her breath caught in her throat. A single word. "Run." May stepped back, her mind racing. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She turned, her boots clicking sharply against the floor as she made her way to the door. A creak, softer now. Behind her, her hand shook as she grabbed the doorknob. Something was wrong. Her pulse raced. She needed to get out. The door slammed shut with a loud bang. Mays froze, her body tense. Her heart skipped a beat. The silence in the room felt suffocating. She turned slowly, her breath shallow. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall. Shadowed. Silent. The faintest glimmer of moonlight caught on something cold. A knife. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. May's hand reached for her radio, but it wasn't there. Her heart sank. She'd left it in the car. The figure took a step forward. Slow. Methodical. Her mouth went dry. Her hands were shaking. The air felt thick now, as if the room itself was closing in. She needed to think, to move. But fear had frozen her feet to the floor. Another step. Closer. She could hear the soft scrape of shoes against the floorboards. May's fingers curled into fists. Her breath quickened. She could barely make out the figure's face in the darkness. A blur of shadow and malice. But the eyes. The eyes were unmistakable. Empty. Hollow. There was no humanity in them. Mays knew then. This wasn't random. This was planned. She needed to survive. Her instincts kicked in. She darted to the side, her legs carrying her to the window. It was small, Too small.
But there was no time.
She shoved her arm through the gap, the glass biting into her skin.
Pain.
But she didn't stop. Her body squeezed through, her chest scraping against the jagged edges. And then, a sharp tug on her leg. She screamed. The figurehead grabbed her. But Maze wasn't done yet. She kicked. Hard. Her foot collided with something. His face? His chest? He let go. For a moment, the pull stopped. She wrenched herself free. Landed hard on the ground outside. Her breath ragged, her body covered in cold sweat. She didn't look back. Not for a second.
She ran.
As fast as she could. Through the dark, empty streets. The sound of her footsteps mingling with the pounding of her heart. Her only thought. To get away. The streetlights flickered overhead as Maze sprinted, her breath ragged and cold in the night air. Her legs burned, but she pushed harder, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She couldn't stop now. Her mind raced. Thoughts blurred. Had she seen something? Was it real? No time for doubt. Her car. She needed to reach her car. The lights of the station were still a few blocks away, but they felt miles off. Every shadow in her peripheral vision made her flinch. Was he behind her? The darkness seemed to crawl, stretching and shifting like a living thing. She dared a quick glance over her shoulder. Nothing. The road was empty. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling. That sickening certainty that she wasn't alone. Another alleyway ahead. A low hiss of wind cut through the stillness. Her mind screamed at her to keep going. She didn't dare slow down. The air felt heavier now, thick and suffocating. She reached the end of the block and turned the corner. There it was, the silhouette of her patrol car parked by the curb, still and waiting. Her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop until she was at the driver's side door. Her hands fumbled with the keys. Her breath quick and shallow as she slid into the seat. The engine roared to life. She slammed the door shut, locking it. A moment of fleeting safety. She could hear the hum of the engine, steady. But then, a sudden crack against the window. Maze jerked back. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked. A hand. Pale, with dark, long fingers. Pressing against the glass. She froze. The fingers slowly slid down, leaving greasy streaks. Her blood ran cold. In the reflection, she saw it. The same hollow eyes. The figure. He was there, right outside her window. She slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel. The tires screeched. Her foot hit the gas hard. The car lurched backward. She didn't dare look again. Not until she had sped far enough away. Down the street, away from that house. Her mind was a blur of panic. Was she safe? Had she gotten away? She glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, all she saw was the empty road behind her. But then, a flash of movement. A dark shape following. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't over. Not yet. Her hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. She needed to get back to the station. To safety. But the figure was closer now, growing larger in the mirror. With every second, her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car roaring as it picked up speed. The road blurred around her, but her eyes never left the rear-view mirror. The shape still there. It was closing in. No matter how fast she drove, the figure stayed with her. Her breath came faster, more erratic. Her mind was spiraling, panic clawing at her chest. She wasn't imagining it. She could see him now clearly. The pale figure, his face twisted in an unnatural grimace. His eyes were locked on her. Cold. Empty. It was as if the world itself had vanished, and only the two of them remained. She floored the accelerator, the engine screaming. But the figure, he didn't run. He didn't chase her in the way she expected. He walked. Slow. Steady. And yet, every time she glanced back, he was just a little closer, like he was gliding through the air, floating just inches above the ground. She swerved, narrowly avoiding the curb. Come on, she muttered, eyes flicking between the mirror and the road ahead. The streetlights passed in streaks of orange and yellow, but her mind was consumed with terror. The sound of the engine was deafening now. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She had to lose him, but there was nowhere to go. The road ahead was endless. Then the radio. A crackle. A voice. Unit 32, come in. Maze gripped the wheel harder, her hands slick with sweat. Her voice came out in a whisper, trembling. This is Officer Maze. He's following me?
A pause.
Then another crackle. Officer Maze, do you copy? Are you at the station? No, she shouted, her voice raw. I'm on Miller's Road. He's right behind me. The voice on the radio crackled again, but the words were lost in static. She glanced in the mirror again. The figure was almost on top of her now. She could see him clearly. His features were distorted, like a nightmare made flesh. His mouth hung open, impossibly wide. And then, the radio cut out completely. A burst of static. Then silence. She reached for the volume, desperation flooding her veins. But before she could turn it up, the headlights flickered. Her vision blurred. A crack. The windshield spiderwebbed. Her heart dropped as the car swerved, veering off course. She slammed on the brakes. Too late. The car spun out of control, screeching across the road. Maze screamed. Everything around her seemed to spin. Then, the crash. The world exploded in a blinding flash of pain. And then nothing. Only the sound of her ragged breath and the faintest whisper of a voice, distant, but clear. Run. Darkness enveloped her, heavy and oppressive. Her body ached, her head spinning. The car had come to a halt, but the world still felt like it was moving. Maze blinked, her vision blurry, struggling to make sense of where she was. The air smelled of burnt rubber and gasoline, sharp in her nostrils. Her hands trembled as they clutched the steering wheel, her chest tight as she gasped for breath. What happened? Her mind raced. The crash. The figure. The whisper. She forced herself to move, pushing against the seat, her legs unsteady as she opened the car door. The night was thick with silence. Too quiet. She stepped out onto the road, stumbling slightly as her feet hit the gravel. Her head throbbed, but she couldn't stop. Her instincts screamed at her to keep moving.
Run.
Her feet carried her, though her body begged her to stop. Each step felt like a struggle, but she pushed forward, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of life. Of help. Nothing. The street was empty. She didn't know how far she had run, how long she had been out here. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. She couldn't stop. The figure. The eyes. Her pulse raced again, a cold sweat forming at the back of her neck. A sudden noise. A scrape. Behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. Only the empty road stretching out in front of her. But she felt it. The pressure. The presence. He was here. Close. She turned quickly, looking desperately for any shelter, any way to hide. A house. The faint outline of a building just ahead. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward it, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs burning. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open, slipping inside. It was dark, but there was a flicker of light in the hallway. The faint sound of a fan whirring. Her breathing was sharp, echoing in the quiet house. She stood still for a moment, her ears straining, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No sounds of pursuit. But the air felt thick again. Heavy. He was close. She could feel it, like a weight pressing on her chest. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a place to hide. The kitchen. She slipped past it, moving toward the back of the house. There, a door. She grabbed the handle. It opened to a small backyard. She stepped outside, her feet brushing against the grass. But there, a figure, in the shadows. He was standing at the edge of the yard. His face was still obscured, but those hollow eyes, staring directly at her. Maze froze. A chill crawled up her spine. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward.
Slowly, deliberately.
Maze backed up, her legs shaking beneath her.
The door.
She rushed for it, throwing it open. Her chest burned as she stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Her breath was ragged, her body shaking with terror. There was no escape. He was everywhere. He would never stop. The door felt like a flimsy barrier, thin against the suffocating darkness outside. May's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed her back against the cold wood, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The house felt different now, alien, hostile. Her pulse raced, and the quiet seemed to stretch longer, each second dragging like hours. She held her breath, waiting for a sound. The creak of a floorboard, the scrape of shoes on the wooden floor. But nothing came, just the rhythmic thud of her own heart. Then, a noise. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound from the other side of the door. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught. It was too soft to be his footsteps. This wasn't just a person. It was something else. The scraping continued, a steady rhythm, getting louder, closer. She backed away slowly, her feet heavy on the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run.
But where?
She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay anywhere. The door rattled as if something was pushing against it, pounding. The wood groaned under pressure, splinters cracking. Maze stumbled backward into the dark hallway, her body trembling. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp. It felt useless in her hands, but she couldn't leave it. She held it tight, every muscle in her body screaming. The rattling stopped for a moment, and for a fleeting second, she thought maybe it had passed. Maybe it wasn't real. But then, a sharp crack. The door splintered, a jagged hole appearing where the knob had been. May's breath quickened. She had no choice now. The window. The window was her only chance. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, her body running on pure instinct. She turned the corner into the living room, her eyes darting to the window. It was small, narrow, just wide enough for her to fit through. She ran to it, hands fumbling as she tried to force it open. The glass was stuck. Her heart pounded in her throat as she tugged harder, frantic. And then, a low, guttural sound. Behind her, a presence that filled the room, like a shadow too vast for any light to pierce. She whipped around, the lamp raised in her hands. But the figure was already there, too close. His face, twisted, dark, void of any humanity, was inches from hers. She could smell him, the metallic scent of blood, the rotten decay that clung to him. May's scream caught in her throat, her body frozen in terror. He grinned, a horrible, jagged smile that split his face wide open. His eyes, the hollow eyes. And then, the world blurred, spinning into a vortex of darkness. The last thing she saw was his hand reaching out to her. Cold, unrelenting. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole. There was no sound, no light. Just a vast, crushing silence. Her body floated, weightless, in a place that felt both far away and too close. Maze tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, sluggish. A whisper lingered in her ears, soft at first, but growing louder. Run. The voice was familiar, terrifyingly familiar. It was his voice. But how? She couldn't remember what had happened. Had she passed out? Had she died? Her chest tightened with panic. No, this couldn't be happening. Suddenly, her body jolted forward, as if pulled by some invisible force. She gasped for air, but the breath never came. Her eyes opened, but the world was still darkness.
She couldn't see.
But then, a light. A flicker, like a dying candle. It was distant, but it pulled her. She reached out instinctively, her hands grasping at the emptiness. The light grew brighter, clearer. And then, her feet touched solid ground. The darkness receded, replaced by a dim glow. The world shifted, and she was no longer in that empty, suffocating space. She stood in the same hallway of the house, but it was different now. The walls were cracked, peeling. The air was thick, suffocating. The smell, iron, was unmistakable. Her body tensed. There, at the end of the hall, the door was wide open. She could see the figure. He stood there, his body still, facing her. His grin was wider now, grotesque. A sickening feeling crept up her spine. May's knees buckled beneath her, but she managed to stay on her feet. Run. The voice whispered again, closer this time. Her instinct screamed at her, but her body refused to listen. She was frozen. The figure took a slow step forward, his footsteps silent. It felt like he was getting closer inch by inch. Every time she blinked, he was closer, closer. And then she could hear him. A low, guttural laugh. His voice dripped with malice. You can't escape. May's heart slammed against her ribcage.
No.
No, she couldn't let him. The light flickered again. This time, brighter. Almost blinding. She reached for it, her body moving on its own. Her legs carried her toward the door, but her feet felt heavy, like she was wading through thick water. She reached out, her hand grasping the doorknob. The moment her fingers touched it, the figure lunged. He was faster than she could ever imagine. His fingers curled around her wrist, pulling her toward him. May screamed, her body jerking back in an attempt to break free. But his grip was iron. His smile grew even wider, almost inhuman. She didn't know how, but the words slipped from her lips. Why? The figure tilted his head, studying her. His eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were all that remained of whatever had been human. A low, rasping voice whispered back, because you were never meant to escape. And then, he pulled her into the darkness. The darkness enveloped her once more, crushing her chest as though it were alive. Her scream was muffled by the weight of the void, her body pulled deeper into its cold, suffocating grip. She couldn't breathe. Her limbs were numb, her vision blurred. She tried to move, to fight, but it was as if her very essence was being drained. The figure's presence was everywhere now, a looming shadow wrapping around her, suffocating her thoughts. His grip on her wrist tightened. It felt like something cold, unnatural, and unrelenting. Her heart pounded in her ears, faster and faster, until it was the only sound she could hear. But then, a shift. The pressure loosened just slightly. Her breath caught. She twisted, desperate to break free. And in that instant, the world snapped back into focus. She was back in the hallway. The door was still open, the figure still standing at the end of it, his grin stretching even further. Her legs burned, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. She was still trapped.
She knew that now.
She had always been trapped. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. She ran. Not toward the door. Not toward the figure. But away from him. Her feet pounded the floor, the sound of her own frantic steps deafening in the otherwise silent house. The air was thick, every breath like inhaling fire. She didn't know where she was going. Didn't care. Just needed to escape. To be anywhere but here. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls pressing in. The windows were still blocked by the same darkness. She could hear him now, his footsteps, slow, deliberate. And then his voice. Why do you run? He asked, low and mocking. His tone wrapped around her like a vice. You can't escape, Maze. You belong here. Just like the others.
She didn't stop.
She couldn't. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she kept moving, one foot in front of the other. But the hallway didn't end. It only grew longer. The door was gone. The windows had vanished. The walls pressed closer, bending, warping as if the house itself was alive, shifting around her. And all the while, his laughter followed.
Loud.
Echoing. Unstoppable. It was then, in that endless stretch of hallway, that she realized she was never going to leave. Not this time. Not ever. Her body fell to the floor. Her chest constricted with the truth. The figure stood above her, watching, waiting. And all Maze could do was watch as the darkness closed in. No escape. Just the never-ending void. And him. May's breath caught in her throat as the figure loomed over her, his presence suffocating, like the air itself was thickening around her. Her heart hammered, but it wasn't enough to drown out the creeping, horrible realization that settled in her chest. She could no longer feel her legs beneath her. They were numb, useless, as if the very foundation of her existence was crumbling away. The figure's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared down at her with something that could only be described as hunger. His smile had turned into something grotesque, stretching too far, too wide, his mouth hanging open in a way that was utterly unnatural. "You tried to escape," he whispered, his voice rasping, sickly sweet. "But there's nowhere to run, officer. Nowhere at all." The words slithered into her mind, twisting around her thoughts like venom. She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry, her tongue heavy and uncooperative. All she could do was lie there, trapped under the weight of his gaze, paralyzed. The darkness in the room deepened, moving with a mind of its own, closing in from all sides. The walls were no longer solid, no longer real. They rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. "No one ever escapes," the figure continued, stepping closer until she could feel the chill emanating from him, sharp and cold against her skin. Not really. Her mind flashed back to that first call. That first moment when she'd knocked on that door, expecting nothing more than a routine check, a mundane task. But she hadn't known. None of them had known. It wasn't a simple welfare check anymore. It never had been. And now, she was part of it. She wanted to scream, to fight, to wake up from whatever nightmare had consumed her, but there was no escaping this. No escaping the pull of the darkness, no escaping him. As his hand reached out toward her, a final, awful smile twisting his features, Maze knew, with crushing certainty, that this was the end. Her body tensed one last time, not out of fear, but out of acceptance. And then, nothing. The light flickered once more, but this time, it didn't return. There was only silence. And the endless void. The silence stretched, oppressive and absolute. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that swallowed every breath, every thought. May's mind drifted, hazy, fragmented. Her body felt suspended in time, frozen between the world she had known and the one that had swallowed her whole. The figure was gone. The laughter had faded, leaving only an echo in her mind, distant but haunting. She was alone now. But there was a strange, eerie comfort in that solitude. The darkness that had consumed her seemed to fade into a softer shade, like the final remnants of a storm passing. The pressure on her chest lifted, as though the weight of a nightmare had finally loosened its grip. The world around her began to shift again, though she couldn't make sense of it. The walls had stopped closing in. The house, once warped and twisted, seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. The eerie distortion of the air lifted. She slowly blinked, unsure if she was seeing things clearly. Was this the end? Or was she somewhere between it? A voice, distant but clear, whispered through the quiet. "Go ahead, walk away." The words were almost too soft to hear, but they stirred something inside her. May slowly lifted her head, her eyes searching the space around her, trying to understand what was happening. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel like it was closing in. Instead, it felt like something she could step through, something that could pass without consuming her whole. The door stood in front of her. It was no longer twisted or broken. It was simply a door. The other side, whatever lay beyond it, was a mystery she couldn't solve. But maybe, just maybe, it was a mystery she didn't need to fear. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing the cold surface of the door. For a moment, she hesitated. The weight of everything, of all that had happened, hung heavy on her mind. But then, with a deep, steadying breath, she grasped the handle. And, in that moment, the house felt as though it had exhaled. She stepped forward, out of the darkness, into the unknown, and as she crossed the threshold, the house behind her began to fade, leaving only silence and the soft whisper of a new beginning.